I was ordered to stay on the hillside while men bled out on a mapped killing ground. The shells walked the valley in careful steps, and every scream from below sounded like a name I knew. My bag, my stretcher, and the folded order on the table all waited for me to choose. So I stepped into the darkness against the map and the voices on the wire, and I have carried that night ever since. In February 1944, on a muddy hillside south of Cassino in Italy, an infantry battalion lay under intermittent artillery fire. The front had stalled along a series of ridges and farm tracks. Rain had turned terraces and drainage ditches into cold ditches of water. The battalion had been in the line for days. Its companies rotated in shallow positions overlooking a low valley. During daylight, movement drew shells. After dusk, the landscape became a pattern of shadows and flares. Behind the forward companies, in a small shelter dug into the reverse slope, the battalion aid post worked with limited light. Canvas sheets, salvaged doors, and corrugated metal formed a fragile cover. Inside, a medic and a small team of stretcher bearers handled whatever the line sent back. He was not the only medical worker in the battalion. The unit had a doctor, orderlies, and litter teams, but among them one battalion medic had become known for going forward more often than the others. He carried a medical bag, scissors tied to it with string, and a torch wrapped in cloth to dull the beam. His day, when rain and enemy fire allowed, followed a pattern. At first light he checked the dressing station's supplies. Sulphur powder, bandages, morphine syrettes, splints, tear and plasma tins were counted and recounted. He reviewed the casualty tags from the night before, noting times and injuries. When the front was quiet, he walked forward along the communication trench. He visited platoon positions, checked on men with persistent coughs or infected blisters. He changed dressings in dugouts that smelled of damp wool and tobacco smoke. Most of his work was small and repetitive, but it kept men on their feet. At the aid post he rarely stood still. When no casualties arrived, he prepared for when they would. Blankets were laid out in a set order. Morphine was checked against the log. The carbide lamp was adjusted to give just enough light to see a wound without shining through the open doorway. On paper, the chain of evacuation was clear. A wounded soldier was to be bandaged at the platoon level. Stretcher bearers would then carry him back to the battalion aid post. From there, a jeep ambulance or mule convoy would move him to the regimental aid station. In practice, night fighting and artillery disrupted everything. Shell bursts cut telephone lines. Paths that were safe at dusk became dangerous after the enemy ranged their guns. Litter teams lost their way or were forced to ground. Doctrinally, the battalion had strict rules for nighttime movement. Once darkness fell and artillery became the primary threat, certain areas were designated killing zones. Across those open spaces, no movement was permitted unless ordered at battalion level. If casualties fell there during bombardment, the priority was to survive the barrage, not to retrieve the wounded immediately. The medic knew the written orders. And he had heard them repeated at briefings, and he signed the sheets acknowledging them. He understood why they were written. Men standing upright in a mapped enemy killing zone made attractive targets for ranging fire. Early that month, an evening attack on a nearby battalion went badly. Casualties lay in an olive grove that had been plotted in enemy fire plans. A small group of stretcher bearers went forward against orders. Within minutes, new shells fell and added more wounded to the grove. The story circulated through the brigade. At a later conference, the lesson was repeated. Do not send medical personnel into an active killing zone at night. Wait until the barrage lifts and the area is checked for shell craters, unexploded rounds and mines. It was a rule anchored as much in bitter experience as in doctrine. The medic at the Cassino hillside listened when his company commander explained the policy again. It was not the first time he'd heard it. On the surface, nothing changed. He continued his rounds. He continued to tape his scissors to his bag and to tie knots in his morphine syrettes to mark used stock. Yet he also kept a quiet tally that did not appear in any report. He remembered the men who had been brought back cold long after their wounds should have been manageable. He knew roughly how long a man with severe bleeding might be able to survive in cold mud. He had seen the difference between those who arrived within minutes and those who arrived after an hour. On several quiet nights, the system seemed to function well enough. A flare would go up, a patrol would report a casualty, and the bearing and distance would be passed back. Stretcher bearers would follow a guide, hugging terraces and ditches, staying off exposed tracks. The medic would meet them at the aid post, headlamp covered, hands already gloved in blood and petrol-soaked cloth. But the hillside was not a static classroom. Ridges, gullies, and terraced fields carved the ground into blind corners. Artillery did not arrive on schedule or respect medical plans. The rule about killing zones often collided with the immediate reality of a man crying out in the dark. One evening in mid-February, the battalion prepared for a limited night patrol. The objective was modest: probe a suspected enemy listening post across the valley floor. Intelligence suggested the enemy had laid additional mines on the approaches. If contact was made, the patrol was to disengage quickly, not press an attack. At last light, the medic adjusted his aid post. He placed extra dressings in a box close to the door. Plasma was set near the small stove to keep it from freezing. He removed his helmet and wiped the inside with a rag. A runner brought him the names of the men on the patrol. He did not need the names for any medical chart, but he read them and folded the paper into his pocket. The patrol stepped off after full darkness. Down in the valley, mist collected over irrigated plots and irrigation channels. Sound carried strangely. Occasional artillery falling further along the line reminded everyone that the guns never really rested. For the first hour, nothing unusual reached the aid post. Telephone reports came through in clipped phrases. Patrol moving. Contact not yet established. Light small arms fire on the left. Then, shortly before midnight, the valley shook under a sudden artillery concentration. The first salvos landed beyond the patrol's probable route. The second bracketed the valley floor. Men from forward positions later said they saw the enemy flares go up seconds before the shells. Within minutes, the battalion command post began receiving fragments of information. The patrol had been caught in the open, close to a track that the enemy clearly had registered, and that track, according to earlier maps, lay squarely inside a designated killing zone. At the aid post, the shells sounded closer than usual. Earth fell from the low ceiling. The carbide lamps swung slightly with each impact. Stretcher bearers instinctively reached for their helmets, even indoors. A runner arrived, breathless and muddy. Here he brought the first clear report. The patrol had at least 3 casualties down on or near the exposed track. The enemy had likely observed movement and was now firing repeat salvos to catch any attempt at withdrawal. Over the field telephone, battalion headquarters relayed its standing orders. No movement was to cross the valley floor until the artillery eased and the area could be assessed. Platoons nearest the track were told to hold their positions and avoid drawing fire. Within the aid post, the medic listened as the message was repeated. He knew that it applied to him and to his stretcher bearers as much as to any rifleman. The order made sense when traced on a map by daylight. In the dark and with screams faintly audible between shell bursts, the logic felt more abstract. He moved to the low doorway and looked out. The darkness cut the hillside into shapes. Shell bursts down in the valley illuminated the olive trees for a second at a time, like harsh lightning. On the floor behind him, blankets lay prepared for the wounded who might or might not arrive. In theory, the casualties would be dragged off the track by their own comrades once the barrage slackened. In reality, the surviving members of the patrol had gone to ground. Any attempt to move risked attracting more fire. The valley floor, narrow and exposed, offered little cover. One of the stretcher bearers, younger than most, asked a simple question. "Do we wait?" The medic did not answer immediately. He listened again to the pattern of shells, counting seconds between impacts, gauging whether the enemy was adjusting. Reports from forward positions continued to arrive, incomplete and grim. And at least one man was heard calling for help. Another, possibly the patrol leader, was last seen crawling toward a ditch and then disappearing in the darkness. No one could say exactly who was still alive. Official doctrine favoured caution. A medical team destroyed by artillery could not help anyone. Unit war diaries were filled with references to medics killed while attempting to reach wounded too soon. The medic at the hillside had seen such entries and had helped bury more than one of his own. Still, he had also seen men die in the time it took for a cautious decision to become a formal order. In his mind, practical arithmetic warred with written instructions. He knew approximately how long major blood loss could be survived. The cold might slow bleeding in some cases, but shock and exposure imposed their own limits. Then he stepped back inside and reached for his bag. He added extra bandages and a second tourniquet. Into a pocket he slipped a small darkened torch that he almost never used. Light was as dangerous as noise on this front. The younger stretcher bearer watched and understood without any need for words. At that moment, a crackling voice over the field telephone repeated the order from battalion headquarters. No one was to attempt a retrieval across the valley floor until the shelling reduced and a route could be cleared. The company commander at the aid post, who had been listening with the medic, repeated the guidance. He spoke calmly, as if reciting something already decided. The medic nodded, but his hands did not stop moving. He picked up his helmet, tested its strap and slung his medical bag over one shoulder. As the young stretcher bearer shouldered one handle of a folded litter, another bearer took the other end. The company commander watched this. He understood exactly what it meant. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he reminded the medic of the written order. The reminder was formal, almost ritual. The medic answered with few words. He acknowledged the order. He stated that he had heard the warning about the killing zone. Then, without raising his voice, he said that men were still alive out there. He did not frame it as an argument, more as a fact. No dramatic confrontation followed. There was no shouting and no prolonged debate. The commander, faced with the choice of physically stopping the medic or letting him go, chose to let him go. He added one condition: the medic was to take only volunteers. The 2 stretcher bearers had already stepped forward. They did not ask for clarity about the risks. They had carried enough wounded to understand them. Another volunteer came from a nearby rifles discuss section, accustomed to moving in that part of the valley. He would guide them as far as possible without leaving his platoon entirely. The small group stepped out into the cold. Behind them, the aid post remained lit by its small lamp and heated by its tiny stove. Ahead lay terraces, low stone walls, and the exposed track that enemy artillery had chosen as its target. At first, the hillside shielded them from direct fire. They moved along a communication trench, then peeled off into a shallow gully. The guide led them in silence, shoulders low, boots feeling for the next foothold. Every few steps they halted, listening for the next salvo. The artillery rhythm had changed. Instead of continuous fire, shells now came in clusters. The enemy was likely conserving ammunition, but remained ready to fire again if movement was detected. The medic knew this pattern from previous nights. Shouts from the valley floor floated up between bursts. They were faint and fragmented by distance and terrain. Some sounded like orders, others like pain. The medic listened for indications of direction and number, building a mental map. As the group approached the valley floor, cover thinned. The terraces became lower. The gully faded into open ground. Beyond a final low wall lay a stretch of track, and then the area the battalion had earlier circled on its map as a killing zone. Officially, no one should be there until daylight or until a formal clearance was ordered. Unofficially, the medic and his small team were already crossing that line. They moved in a crouch, dragging the folded stretcher close to the ground. Mud clung to boots and trousers, making every step heavier. A shell landed further down the valley, throwing a brief cone of light across the track. In that flash, the medic saw a dark shape lying near the edge of the wheel ruts. It did not move. He also saw another figure slightly beyond, closer to an irrigation ditch, attempting to roll onto one side. They reached the nearer casualty first. He was unconscious, his leg twisted unnaturally. A quick check revealed heavy bleeding from the thigh. The medic applied a tourniquet in the dark, hands moving by habit more than sight. He packed dressings under the strap, tightened it, and noted the time by touch on his wristwatch. There was no chance to write a formal casualty tag. Paper would soak in seconds, and there was no light to see it anyway. Instead, he tied a strip of cloth near the tourniquet to mark it for whoever treated the man next. He felt for breathing, checked for other wounds, then nodded once to the bearers. They unfolded the stretcher with practiced quiet. The unconscious man was lifted with as little movement as possible. Each sound felt magnified in the dark. They had just started to move when another salvo of shells landed, closer this time. The team dropped to the ground, sheltering the stretcher as best they could. Shrapnel hissed overhead, some pieces hitting stones with sharp metallic sounds. When the air fell silent, they rose and moved again, this time choosing a slightly different route that hugged a shallow depression. To move the second casualty required more time. He was conscious but disoriented, calling for comrades who had already reached safety or had not moved at all. A wound at his shoulder bled steadily, and fragments had peppered his side. The medic worked with limited movement, conscious that every minute spent there increased their exposure. He applied a pressure dressing and immobilized the man's arm. Morphine was measured carefully. Too much could slow breathing dangerously in the cold. He whispered simple instructions into the man's ear, not for drama but to prevent sudden movements during the lift. The bearers waited for a lull in the distant gunfire before hoisting the stretcher. As they began the return journey, the enemy resumed intermittent shelling of the valley floor. So whether the movement had been seen or the fire was part of a pre-planned pattern, no one could say. The small teams slowed whenever the pattern tightened and moved quicker when the gun shifted. At times they simply lay beside their stretchers, bodies between shrapnel trajectories and the wounded. The climb back up the hillside felt longer than before. Mud dragged at the stretcher poles. Hands numbed by cold and effort struggled to keep a steady grip. The guide, having fulfilled his role, dropped back to his platoon's line, leaving the medic to navigate the familiar last stretch. At the aid post, the doorway became a narrow rectangle of light. Men inside cleared space as soon as the first stretcher appeared. There was no applause, no visible relief, only a rapid shift into practiced routines. Blankets were pulled aside, and instruments readied. Plasma hung from improvised hooks. The doctor took over immediate treatment. He asked brief questions about wounds and time since injury. The medic reported the tourniquet placement, the approximate time, and the amount of morphine given. Details came in short phrases, stripped of any comment on how or from where the men had been retrieved. Outside, the stretcher bearers leaned against the hillside, catching breath and wiping mud from their hands. One of them vomited quietly, a reaction to the intensity rather than illness. After a few minutes, they went back inside to clean and refold their equipment. In war diaries, such moments rarely merited more than a single line, if that. Within the battalion command post, the situation was recorded differently. The operations log noted artillery fire, casualties, and the eventual retrieval of wounded. Somewhere in those pages, probably in marginal comments or in unofficial recollections, the decision to move into the killing zone might have appeared, but the formal record focused on timings and numbers. The next morning, when grey light exposed the valley, other details emerged. Unexploded shells lay partly buried in the mud near the track. A few bodies from the patrol remained where they had fallen. Not everyone could be reached in time. Engineers marked hazardous areas with white cloth and wooden stakes. At a routine briefing, brigade staff reviewed the night's events. There was concern about the patrol's route and about the enemy's rapid adjustment of fire. Risk to medical personnel was mentioned in passing as part of a discussion on adherence to movement restrictions. There was no clear consensus on whether the medic's action had been acceptable or not. Some officers regarded the decision as reckless. They argued that 1 or 2 lives saved did not justify exposing trained medical personnel to concentrated fire. Others, closer to the line, valued the outcome more directly. To them, the fact that at least 2 badly wounded men had reached the aid post alive mattered more than the violation of an order. The medic himself did not offer a justification in the formal sense. He had no time for extended explanations. The next night another patrol went out, and the aid post had to be ready again. Supplies needed restocking, bandages boiling, and equipment repaired. Still, words circulated among the men. Those who had heard shouted fragments from the valley floor compared them with the arrival of the wounded back at the aid post. They understood that the interval between injury and treatment had been shortened by a choice that ran against written doctrine. In barrack room conversations and at the edges of dugouts, the medic's name was associated with that night. From higher up the chain, the response remained muted. No formal commendation was issued at that time. Equally, no disciplinary action was taken. The whole episode existed in a grey area that armies often occupy, between strict procedure and practical necessity. In the weeks that followed, the battalion remained on that front. The medic continued his routine. He taped more scissors, counted more dressings, marked more tourniquet times on improvised tags. But when shells fell further along the valley, or when patrols reported mines, he listened with the same attentive silence. A pattern emerged in his conduct, not visible in single reports but apparent to those who served alongside him. He did not ignore orders casually or seek opportunities to step outside them. Most nights he remained at the aid post as required, delegating retrieval to stretcher bearers and line troops, but when he believed that delay would likely turn survivable wounds into fatalities, he prepared to move forward himself. Such decisions never fully aligned with written doctrine. Official training manuals emphasize controlled evacuation, stabilize at the point of wounding when possible, prioritize safe movement, and accept that some casualties would not be reachable immediately. Yet those same manuals acknowledged, in cautious language, that medics often operated under conditions far from ideal. Between lines of text, there was space for individual judgment. For the battalion's leadership, the tension became evident. They needed medics alive to serve future casualties. They also recognized the effect on morale when wounded men believed they would not be left to die unaided in exposed ground. Balancing those realities required more than a set of rules. On another harsh night, weeks after the killing zone incident, the battalion endured a renewed barrage. This time the shelling struck closer to the hillside positions. Casualties came in quickly, carried by squads that had barely left their trenches. The medic, overwhelmed with immediate work at the aid post, could not go forward even if he had wished to. In that moment, the earlier unofficial decision bore indirect fruit. Stretcher bearers and riflemen, having seen the medic's willingness to move into danger, now moved with additional determination themselves. They knew he would not ask of them something he refused to do. Several later commented that they could not leave a comrade in the open, knowing how hard their medic had fought to retrieve men before. For the wounded, the difference was subtle but real. Some arrived sooner, still coherent enough to answer questions. Bleeding that might have cost a limb or a life was controlled earlier. At the scale of an entire theatre, such differences did not rewrite campaigns. At the scale of a single battalion's experience, they mattered greatly. After that winter, the battalion eventually rotated out of the Cassino sector. New men arrived, and some who had known the medic from earlier stages of the war were transferred away or sent home with wounds. Stories about the night crossing into the killing zone travelled with them, altered slightly with each retelling, but retaining a core of factual detail. Official histories of the campaign focused on larger movements. They described corps-level offensives, air support, and the slow advance through mountains and valleys. Battalion aid posts appeared mainly as symbols of the medical system's structure, rarely as sites of contested decision-making. The individual medic's choice that night remained absent from most published accounts. In regimental newsletters and reunion conversations, however, fragments persisted. A few veterans mentioned a night when their battalion medic ignored instructions to stay behind. They recalled seeing a small column of figures move down a slope under shell fire. They remembered hearing later that those men had brought back the comrades who might otherwise have been recorded among the dead. From an institutional perspective, such actions posed a problem. If formally praised, they might encourage others to take similar risks in less justifiable circumstances. If formally condemned, they risked undermining the trust that wounded men placed in the medical chain. The solution often adopted in wartime was to let such episodes reside in an unofficial space. There they still influenced behaviour. Young medics, hearing the story second-hand, understood that doctrine existed for good reasons but could not foresee every situation. Commanders, aware of the incident but not forced to rule on it publicly, they'll learn to evaluate each decision in context rather than by rule alone. The army, as an organisation, absorbed the lesson without inscribing it formally. For the medic himself, the war continued in the same pattern of exhausting routine and sudden crisis. He seldom spoke about his own actions. Medical personnel often carried with them a sense of unfinished work. Every life lost overshadowed those saved. Years later, if asked, he might have described that night as one of several, not as a unique event. What remained constant was the environment that had produced the decision. Narrow valleys registered by enemy artillery, orders to prevent unnecessary movement in known killing zones, written by staffs trying to reduce loss. A medical doctrine in emphasizing safety and system, confronted by the immediate reality of voices in the dark. The story of that hillside is one of many from the Second World War in which medical workers operated between lines, literal and procedural. They moved in spaces where maps declared movement forbidden, but where human need persisted all the same. Their work did not alter the course of campaigns in obvious ways, but it shaped the lived experience of the men who fought them. For those who study the war now, such episodes provide a narrower but vital lens. They reveal how doctrine and practice interacted at the level of a single night, a handful of men, and a small aid post on a hillside. They show how a medic, not seeking recognition, weighed written orders against the tangible cost of waiting. On that February night south of Cassino, artillery made the valley floor a place no one was meant to cross, yet a small group did, and carrying a folded stretcher and a bag of bandages. They moved not because a plan demanded it, but because a medic decided that for certain wounded men, delay would be fatal. His action left no large monument, no entry in campaign summaries. What endured instead were the men who lived to remember being lifted from the mud, and the quiet shift in expectations among those who served with him. Within that battalion, the idea took root that medical care did not end at the edge of safety, even when regulations suggested it should. It was a narrow, dangerous space in which to work, but many medics across the war found themselves in similar positions. Stories like this illuminate those spaces. They draw attention not to dramatic heroism, but to deliberate, measured choices made in difficult conditions. They remind viewers that war is shaped as much by such quiet decisions in aid posts along narrow tracks under artillery in the dark as by strategies drawn on high maps. For a channel dedicated to these less visible aspects of the conflict, such accounts help preserve a more complete record. They honour not only those who fought, but those who walked into killing zones with stretchers, knowing that their work might never be fully recorded. If this kind of careful human-level history is valuable to you, consider supporting more of it by watching, sharing, or subscribing so that these quieter stories of the war are not lost to time.